The moment came when I realized that my family would never care for me the way I had cared for them. I couldn't speak, I couldn't move. I just lay helpless in a hospital bed and watched as the people I loved most argued about who owed me less. That day I realized one thing. I had spent my entire life serving a family that wouldn't lift a finger to help me. And then I did something no one expected. But let's go back to the beginning. It started with a teacup. I had just wrapped my fingers around my favorite one, when it slipped right through my hand and shattered on the kitchen floor. I remember thinking, that's odd. I wasn't clumsy, at least not usually. But then I noticed I couldn't move my left arm. My mouth felt strange too, like it belonged to someone else entirely. I tried to speak, but the words came out all twisted and broken like radio static. I must have looked like a deflated balloon, sagging against the counter, drooling on my robe. Now, I'm not one for dramatics. I've dealt with hip replacements, 3 decades of PTA meetings, and the horror that was my husband's attempt at homemade lasagna. But this was different. I was paralyzed on one side and could feel panic crawling up my spine like a dozen cold spiders. Thankfully, or so I thought at the time, my husband Harold was home. He heard the crash and came running. Harold had once been a high school chemistry teacher with more interest in model trains than human emotion. But even he looked alarmed when he found me collapsed on the linoleum, twitching like an old record player skipping its groove. He yelled something, I think. Then he ran off to get our daughter, Nadine. She lived with us temporarily, her term not mine, after leaving her latest creative marketing job in Los Angeles. Nadine came stumbling out of her room, her phone still in one hand, face squinting at the light like a vampire in a midday sunbeam. Harold called the ambulance while Nadine hovered near the doorway, muttering, oh no, as though that were somehow helpful. By the time the paramedics wheeled me out, I felt less like a person and more like an exhibit at one of the museums I used to curate. Hours passed at the hospital. Nadine sat beside me, tapping at her phone, and eventually my son Dennis arrived. He wore a polo shirt 2 sizes too tight and carried himself like a man in a business pitch. Dennis worked in insurance and considered small talk a waste of time. When the doctor came in and delivered the news, minor stroke, early enough for decent recovery, but I'd need support at home, I felt a strange kind of hope. Surely with Harold and the kids we could manage. I'd done so much for them. Babysat their kids, lent them money, put my dreams aside so they could chase theirs. Then Harold stood up. Well, he said, I promised Elaine I'd help organize the community quilt show this week. I'll be staying at her place for a bit. You two figure out the rest. He said it like he was talking about trash duty, not his wife of 40 years. Before I could even process the betrayal, Nadine and Dennis were at each other's throats, arguing about who had done more for me and who had paid back less. I lay there, slack-jawed and soaked in disbelief, watching the two people I'd raised trade insults like we were all in some poorly written soap opera. No one asked how I felt. No one touched my hand. They just argued. And I, Eleanor Thompson, once the keeper of fine art and forgotten stories, realized with a clarity sharper than glass, my years of love had turned invisible. Right then I knew. Something inside me had cracked. Not just my body, but something deeper. Let me tell you something. Being wheeled out of the hospital in a pair of borrowed slippers and a coat that didn't match my pajama pants was not how I imagined my grand return home. But Nadine insisted. Said the nurses were overreacting, that home healing was more holistic. Never mind that the woman who once used a glue stick instead of lip balm was now claiming medical authority. She picked me up in her hatchback that smelled like incense and old French fries. The ride was silent, save for the soft clatter of art supplies rolling around in the back. I glanced over at her once, thinking maybe she'd say something, anything, to make me feel safe. Instead, she adjusted her sunglasses and turned up some ambient playlist that sounded like a whale trying to play a harmonica. Back at the house, she shuffled me into the guest room like I was an Amazon delivery. She'd cleared off the bed but hadn't bothered with the sheets. There was glitter on the pillowcase and a half-finished watercolor of a lopsided banana taped to the wall. I thought you'd like some color, she said. I didn't respond. I was too busy wondering why she hadn't called a visiting nurse or, heaven forbid, someone who knew what a blood pressure cuff was. The next few days blurred into each other. Nadine brought meals when she remembered, usually smoothies that tasted like lawn clippings. I asked for something solid, toast maybe, but she'd shrug and say, fiber is healing. She'd leave the door cracked open and vanish into her studio, which was really just the dining room she'd claimed with a folding table and 12 open paint tubes. Harold hadn't returned. Not that I expected him to. He texted once to say he was giving me space to recover, which was rich coming from a man who used to shout across the house anytime he couldn't find his tweezers. I couldn't walk on my own yet, and there was no railing installed. No one helped me bathe, so I sat there most days, itchy and embarrassed, praying I wouldn't soil the sheets. One morning I tried to call out for help, but Nadine had headphones on, humming and swirling blues onto a canvas. I could hear her giggling on a phone call later, saying, "She's totally fine, just resting. She's dramatic like that." It was worse than being invisible. I was inconvenient. Then came the moment I'll never forget. My grandson, little Leo, came by with Nadine's ex, who dropped him off for the afternoon. Leo is 6, full of questions and missing one front tooth. He bounded into my room like a ray of sunlight, holding a Lego spaceship. "Grandma, guess what?" he shouted. "Mom says you live here now, 'cause you're cheaper than a nurse." He grinned, so proud to share. I laughed, because what else can you do when your heart folds in half? After he left, I stared at the ceiling fan, wondering how the woman who used to write me love notes in crayon had turned into someone who saw me as a burden. Nadine tiptoed in that evening with a cold smoothie and no eye contact. "Everything okay?" she asked, already turning to leave. "Oh, just peachy," I muttered. "If this smoothie gets any greener, it'll sprout legs." She didn't laugh. She never did when the joke was about her. I stopped asking for things after that. Stopped trying to explain what I needed. Silence, it turns out, is easier to manage than hope. At least silence doesn't talk back. I had stashed the old flip phone in my sock drawer 2 Christmases ago, back when Nadine insisted I get a smartphone. "So you can FaceTime and keep up," she said, as if I were auditioning for a tech startup. I kept the flip phone anyway. Good thing too, because when your world shrinks to a single room and a green smoothie diet, you start looking for escape routes. I waited until Nadine went out to source inspiration for her art. Translation: loiter at the cafe downtown and scroll her phone. In the silence of the house, I reached for the drawer, my fingers trembling like a wind-up toy losing energy. The phone was there. It was turned off, but the battery was still slightly charged. I dialed Judith's number by feel. I've known that woman's number longer than I knew my wedding vows. Judith and I met in the library stacks at Wadsworth College, both reaching for the same dusty copy of Jane Eyre. She's been my person ever since. A retired librarian with an opinion on everything and an allergy to nonsense. She once told off a city councilman during a town hall for misquoting Mark Twain, and I've loved her ever since. She picked up on the second ring. "Eleanor." Her voice was sharp, alert. "You all right?" "No," I whispered. "I'm not." That's all it took. No long explanation, no guilt trip. She said she'd be there in 20. And she was. Maroon Subaru. Sensible shoes. Sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. She knocked once and let herself in like she owned the place. When she stepped into my room and saw me hunched on that twin bed in a house that no longer felt like mine, her jaw clenched. "Get your things," she said. "We're leaving." "I can't, Nadine." "Nadine can stick her smoothies," Judith snapped. "You need help. Real help." She helped me into my shoes, orthopedic, and grabbed the bag I'd quietly packed in my head 100 times. Judith didn't even look at Nadine's art supplies as we passed the dining room. She muttered something about glitter being the herpes of the craft world and marched me to the car like she was rescuing a kitten from a burning shed. Back at the hospital, the nurse at the desk blinked when she saw us. "She was discharged," she started. Judith leaned forward. "She was dumped. There's a difference. They took me in, got me settled, ran tests. Turns out I wasn't recovering as smoothly as Nadine's online updates would have suggested. Imagine that. They kept me a few nights for observation, and this time I wasn't alone." Judith sat in the chair beside me, knitting something lumpy and neon. "You're making a scarf?" I asked. "Nope. It's a statement piece. It says, 'Don't mess with my best friend.'" We laughed, real laughter, the kind that shakes your ribs a little. 2 days later, a gentle woman named Rosa appeared at my bedside. She was the live-in caregiver Judith had hired on a trial basis. Rosa had kind eyes, sensible shoes, and a laugh like warm cinnamon rolls. She helped me bathe without making me feel like a broken appliance. She made eggs the way I liked them, fluffy but not too fluffy. She even hummed when she folded laundry. I didn't know what came next. But for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt human again. Like maybe my life wasn't just something happening to me, but something I could shape again. With Judith, Rosa, and a real cup of hot tea, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. When I came back home, it felt like walking into a museum exhibit titled, "Woman Interrupted." Nothing had changed, and that was the problem. Nadine was still spread out in the dining room with canvases and paint tubes like she was preparing for an art apocalypse. The kitchen smelled faintly of microwaved kale. And my cozy little house, the one Harold and I had bought back when shag carpeting was still fashionable, was now operating more like a crash pad for one very entitled adult child. But something had changed. Me. The Eleanor who'd left this house weeks earlier wouldn't have said a word about the dishes in the sink or the laundry draped like avant-garde installations over the sofa. The Eleanor who came back? Oh, she had opinions and a spine. The first time Nadine asked, "Could you maybe throw in a load of towels while I run out?" I looked up from my cup of chamomile and said no. Just that. No explanation. No gentle tone. No baked goods to soften the blow. Her head jerked back like I'd slapped her with a zucchini. "Wait, are you mad at me?" she asked, blinking. Mad? No, darling, I said, folding my napkin. I'm just not your maid. The silence was so thick you could have cut it with one of her unused palette knives. From that day on, I stopped doing. No more folding Nadine's laundry. No more quietly restocking her almond milk. No more babysitting Leo on short notice while she claimed to be networking, which was code for having coffee with people who also didn't have jobs. At first, she tried guilt. "You always loved helping," she whined one morning. "I also used to love Twinkies," I replied. "We all grow out of things." Then came the passive aggression. She started playing sad folk music loudly and sighing whenever she walked past me. I ignored her. I'd learned from Rosa, who still checked on me every few days, that boundaries were healthy. Revolutionary even. But the final straw came on a Tuesday. I walked into the living room and found Nadine on the phone with a friend, saying, and I quote, "Yeah, I'm still living with Mom. But she's old and recovering, so it's not like she needs much space." Not much space? I'd given this girl everything but my spleen, and now I was just background furniture? That evening, I made coffee and made an important call to the moving company's swift exit. It was Judith's idea. By Thursday, I had 3 young guys in identical t-shirts packing Nadine's paints and indie band posters. Nadine came home mid-pack. "Are you moving?" she asked, wide-eyed. "No," I said, sipping my coffee. "You are." The color drained from her face like someone had unplugged her. "You're serious?" she whispered. "As a hip replacement," I said. I handed her a list of affordable apartments Judith had printed from the library's community board and even offered to cover the security deposit one time. She didn't thank me. She sniffled, pouted, stomped a bit, but eventually she left. And then came the quiet. Not the sad kind. Not the there's no one left kind. The good kind. The kind where you hear your own thoughts and realize they're actually quite pleasant. I rearranged the furniture, lit a lavender candle, and made myself a grilled cheese. I signed up for community college the same week I bought a spiral notebook with purple polka dots and a set of gel pens that smelled faintly like bubblegum. At my age, you don't do things halfway. If I was going to be a student again, I wanted the whole experience, minus the dorm food and existential dread. The woman at the admissions desk squinted at me over her glasses. "Creative writing?" she asked, typing slowly. "That's right," I said. "And no, I'm not auditing. I want the grades." She blinked like I'd grown a second head, but handed me a student ID badge with a lanyard anyway. I felt like royalty. My first class was poetic voice and structure. The professor was all elbow patches and metaphors, and most of my classmates were the kind of 20-somethings who wear beanies indoors and drink coffee with oat milk. But they welcomed me like a mascot. I started jotting down lines during breakfast, snippets of thought during laundry, and I even turned one of Harold's old ties into a bookmark. Everything was humming along beautifully until Dennis showed up. He let himself in with the spare key I forgot to confiscate and stood in my kitchen with his arms folded like a tax auditor. He scanned the fridge, then the pile of poetry books on my table, then me in my write or retreat sweatshirt. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked. "Never better," I said, stirring my tea. "I just don't understand," he said. "You're taking classes now? Shouldn't you be?" "I don't know, focusing on rest." "Dennis," I said sweetly, "I've rested enough to qualify as a couch cushion." He didn't laugh. He went on to suggest, very gently of course, that maybe I should consider helping out more. With his twins. With errands. With something productive. I reminded him that poetry was productive. He looked at me like I'd taken up interpretive dance. Then, like a plot twist in a bad sitcom, Harold walked in. I let him in, Dennis muttered. Harold was carrying a duffel bag and wearing that old windbreaker he thought made him look sporty. It just made him look like a lost coach. Figured I'd stay here a bit, he announced, like I was the receptionist at a B&B. I blinked. Why? Well, Elaine's traveling and the garden club's on break. And you know, we've got history. I nearly choked on my tea. So does the Titanic, I said. Still sunk. He chuckled like I was being coy and asked what was for dinner. Oh, I said, smiling, I believe the phone book is in the drawer. It's under takeout. Harold's smile faded. That night, I wrote a poem titled The Guest Who Wasn't and read it aloud in class the next day. Got a standing ovation. I started spending more time at the library, joined a writers group that met in the basement of the Methodist church, and began submitting little essays to a local zine. One of them got published. I framed it and hung it above the coffee maker. I didn't owe anyone explanations anymore. Not for how I spent my time, not for the dust on the mantle, and certainly not for who got dinner and who didn't. Let them judge. Let them stew. I had pens that smelled like bubblegum and a heart full of rhymes. That was enough. When Harold started pruning my rose bushes without asking, I knew the end was near. He'd been camping out in my guest room for 2 weeks uninvited, naturally. He started throwing socks all over the hallway again, humming tunes from musicals at breakfast, and commenting on the excessive number of decorative pillows on my couch. Apparently, Harold thinks that 3 is practical, but 5 is emotional clutter. I ignored him as best I could until the roses. I'd been nursing those poor bushes back to life for months. Bought them on clearance. Gave them names, Patience and Ruby, and even read them poetry when I watered. Harold decided they looked unkempt and took the shears to them like he was taming the Amazon. I found him whistling in the garden, surrounded by petals and smugness. Why would you do that without asking? I asked. He shrugged. Just helping out. This place could use a man's touch. That was it. Later that night, I poured myself a small glass of ginger ale, sat down at the kitchen table, and wrote one sentence in my notebook. It's time. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Judith recommended a woman named Felicia who wore statement earrings and had a voice like a velvet buzzsaw. When I told her I wanted to file for divorce, she didn't flinch. Just nodded and said, "Took you long enough, darling." When I broke the news to Harold, he was eating my last slice of banana bread and watching a documentary about model trains. "I'm divorcing you," I said plainly. He looked up mid-bite. "What? Why?" I counted on my fingers. 42 years of taking me for granted, your humming, the roses, the sock trail, and your belief that my blender is too loud. He blinked. "You're serious?" As a tetanus shot, I replied. The reaction from the children was almost worse. Dennis called and started with, "Mom, are you sure this isn't just a phase?" "What am I, 15? I asked. "You think I'm dyeing my hair purple and running off with a barista?" Nadine tried guilt. "But Dad doesn't have anywhere else to go." "Then perhaps he should have pruned his own life a little more carefully," I said. I went through with it. Signed every document with a clicky pen shaped like a flamingo. Harold moved into a one-bedroom apartment near the strip mall and joined a jazz meetup group for retired musicians. He sent me a photo of himself holding a saxophone and smiling like he hadn't just lost the best banana bread of his life. I didn't reply. Sold the house. For my share of the money, I bought myself a studio apartment 2 blocks from the library. Hardwood floors. Big windows. A kitchen just for me. I painted one wall yellow and set up a reading nook with my polka dot notebooks and a lamp that looks like a flamingo. My name was finally on a lease that belonged to no one else. I was free. Only unexpected twists and turns awaited me further on. It started with a flyer I made on my little printer. The flyer had a sunflower on it and a headline that read, "Women over 50, let's take back our time." I tacked it to the bulletin board at the library. I didn't expect anyone to show up. But the next Tuesday, 7 women sat around the folding tables in the community room, sipping tea and eyeing each other like we were in a support group for UFO sightings. One had on sparkly sneakers. Another wore a scarf that looked like it had been hand-painted with hummingbirds. And all of them had that same look behind the eyes, tired, hopeful, maybe a little itchy for something new. "I'm not a therapist," I said, standing in front of the whiteboard. "I'm just a woman who got tired of folding other people's socks." They chuckled. One of them actually clapped. We started with introductions. Margaret used to teach high school English and hadn't read a book for pleasure in 10 years. Doreen had raised 5 children and was still cooking dinner for 3 of them, none of whom paid rent. Gloria had dreams of being a travel photographer but had never left the Midwest. That first meeting, we just talked. By the third week, we had a name, the Silver Liners. Judith joined as our guest expert in week 4 and taught a workshop on using email without accidentally CCing the entire family reunion. Rosa brought in her homemade scones and showed us how to make simple meal plans that didn't involve feeding a small army. I hosted a poetry circle where we read our own work or something that once gave us goosebumps. One week, Gloria read a poem she wrote about her hands, the same hands that held babies, packed lunches, scrubbed grout, and now wanted to hold a camera. Then go take pictures, I told her. I don't know how to start, she said. So we Googled local photography classes together. Another week, Doreen stood up and announced she was telling her 34-year-old son to do his own laundry. I'm your mother, she told him that morning. Not your maid. Then she looked around the room and said, I didn't know I could say that out loud. Oh, the cheers that followed. We nearly broke the folding chairs. We started meeting twice a week, one night for workshops, another for what we called Tea and Triumph, where we shared any small victory. A walk taken alone, a boundary set, a new recipe tried without consulting anyone's preferences but our own. Word spread. A woman named Linda brought her friend Joan, who brought her sister Elise, who brought baked zucchini muffins so good we nearly declared her president. The librarian gave us a permanent slot on the schedule. One evening, after our journaling session, I looked around at the group, all laughing, scribbling, sipping tea, and thought, this is what a revolution looks like when you're wearing compression socks and sensible shoes. We didn't wear matching shirts. We didn't march. But by golly, we showed up. And every time a woman left that room with her chin a little higher and her back a little straighter, I felt it in my bones. The tide was turning. And we were the wave. Harold's fall from grace came with all the drama of a daytime soap and none of the good lighting. Word got to me through Nadine, who delivered the news with the breathless flair of someone reporting a neighborhood scandal. Dad's in the hospital, she said. Celeste left him. Apparently, she thought, low-maintenance gardening didn't mean he'd lounge in a lawn chair while she mowed the yard. I didn't ask what happened. Didn't need to. I'd lived with Harold long enough to know that even the most patient daffodil would eventually pack its petals and walk out. He's asking for you, Nadine added, as if that changed anything. I agreed to visit. Not because I felt guilty, but because I wanted to see him one last time, not the man who once brought me tulips from the corner market, but the one who thought dishwashers loaded themselves. The hospital room was beige in every sense of the word. Harold looked smaller somehow. Deflated, like someone had opened a valve and let the hot air seep out. Eleanor, he croaked, you look, well. I am, I said, setting down a vase of daisies. Thanks for noticing. He gestured weakly. They say I need someone full-time for a while. Thought maybe. No, I said, kind but firm. You'll need to sort that with Nadine and Dennis. He blinked, surprised. But you're always the one who... I interrupted. But not anymore. I gave him a soft pat on the shoulder, left the daisies, and walked out. I didn't look back. That weekend, we held the one-year anniversary gala for the Silver Liners at the community hall. The folding chairs were replaced with twinkle lights and borrowed tablecloths. Rosa brought her famous lemon bars. Judith wore a feathered hat just because she could, and someone's granddaughter played the cello with more enthusiasm than precision. At some point, someone handed me the mic. I cleared my throat, adjusted my reading glasses, and looked out at the crowd of women who, like me, had once been silent out of habit, not choice. Some of us waited too long to reclaim our time, I said. But that doesn't mean it's too late. It means we're right on time. Applause. Sniffles. Even a whoop from the back, probably from Linda, who'd finally told her grown children to stop leaving wet towels on her couch. We don't need permission, I continued. We need courage. And we've got that now. We are not invisible. We are not retired, we are rewired. And we're just getting started. The room erupted. We lit candles for each woman who had taken a new step that year, gone back to school, started painting again, opened an Etsy shop, told someone, no, and meant it. As the candles flickered and the piano played an off-key but heartfelt rendition of This Little Light of Mine, I realized this wasn't just a group. It was a movement. A late-life rebellion wrapped in elastic waistbands and big dreams. And I, Eleanor Thompson, was proud to be its accidental ringleader.
Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a turning point where you realized it was time to put yourself first? If you liked the story, subscribe to the channel and give us a like.